Hello, good day, good evening, good morning, good afternoon to everyone. Can everyone hear me?
Um, yes po.
All right, so welcome to this session entitled Modernity, Economic Resource Mobilization, and Decoloniality. I am Lorna Israel from the Department of International Studies, Miriam College, and I will be the moderator for these sessions. Just for some preliminary announcements, Aaron, can we show the, all right. So these are just some basic reminders to all of us. This session is being recorded. The recording will be made available at a later date. If you can keep your microphone set on mute, all questions must be coursed through the chat box function of the Zoom meeting room. You may indicate the speaker to whom you are addressing your inquiry. Observe discretion if you are posting on the chat box. The moderator has the slight power to remove attendees exhibiting unacceptable decorum in the session. If you wish to receive a certificate of attendance, you must first accomplish the evaluation form sent with the Zoom credentials. The evaluation form will be accepting responses after the conference. Just to provide you with an overview of what's in store for you this morning, let me just run through or read through the paper presentations, the three presenters this morning. No, we have a water theme, no, for this morning, from its liquid to its coffee form to its troubled form. One of the presenters is Ryan Dave Rayla, and is from the University of San Jose-Recoletos. His presentation is entitled Troubled Waters, Water Conflicts in the Philippines as Decolonization Narratives. The next one is from Twinkle Bautista from Coffee for Peace. The presentation is entitled Decolonizing and Localizing Peacebuilding through Social Enterprise, the story of Coffee for Peace and Peacebuilders community. The last presentation, but certainly not the least, is from Archill Niña Capistrano from the University of the Philippines, Cebu. Her presentation is entitled Traversing the Intersections of Decoloniality and Liquid Modern Consumerism in Human Trafficking. So this is how we are going to proceed with our morning session. We will divide the time between paper presentations and open forum. So first, we will have first, all the presenters will present their papers, and each presenter is given 15 to 20 minutes for their presentation, after which we will proceed with the open forum or the Q&A. You may use the chat box for your Q&A. So with that, let's begin the session and I call on Ryan to start the presentation. Ryan, you may start. You have 15 minutes, so it's 9:07 in my clock. You have until 9:20, more or less, give or take. Take it away, Ryan.
Thank you for the introduction, ma'am. Good morning, everyone. I am Ryan Dave Rayla from the University of San Jose-Recoletos, and I'm here to present one of the offshoots of my thesis. It's called Troubled Waters, Water Conflict in the Philippines as Decolonization Narratives. So a few years ago, one of my one of the panel members for my thesis asked, is water political, in relation to my original topic? And that question has led me down to serious considerations of water as a niche topic for me in political science. And that has led me here to this conference in seeking further answers to the question, is water political? So I'll be sharing my screen now and my presentation. Um, Ma'am Moderator, can you allow me to screen? Okay.
Yes, you can. Go ahead, Ryan.
Okay, thank you.
All right, you're on.
Okay. So um, for this morning, my presentation will be taking these steps. No, we shall talk about first the rationale and the statement of the problem, and then the theoretical framework of the presentation of the paper that I wrote, and then we have the case cited and the analysis and conclusion. This paper actually follows the format of one of the papers of Professor Araral, in that it was a literature review of all the previous written works about water. So it is actually a selected a selected array of cases that I have analyzed using thematic analysis and using the theoretical frameworks, which I will present. Okay, so water is a global concern. So this is the backdrop or the rationale of my study. So water as a global concern touches on many sustainable development goals. In fact, many of the discourses of water as a commodity or privatization of water resources, and there's also the discourse on water as a public right or nationalization of the water industry, as had happened in many countries, no? Particularly the case of Bolivia. Water is a vital resource in life, as we all know. And in the 21st century, the reality of water conflicts as an effect of globalization and, of course, as an effect of climate change is becoming a reality. In fact, it has prompted some authors to refer to water as liquid gold or blue gold. And in certain areas, like for example in Gaza, where water supply is being controlled by the Israelis, no, to the detriment of many Palestinians, and also in the recent dam making projects in the around the Mekong River, around the sources of the Mekong River, in um, in in Indochina and in mainland Southeast Asia, it has led to many water contestations and water conflicts. We shall define later what is water contestations and water conflicts, as this has many nuances and dimensions, which I wish to share to everyone present. Okay. So the rationale of the study came about, or rather, the rationale of the study is based on the um, on the emerging water crisis that we find ourselves in, with climate change and with many other sources. This is also because primarily this is driven by not only my thesis but also the reality here in my hometown in Cebu, where water is drying up, and we are faced with with many problems that may arise soon as a consequence of water sources drying up. So as a global concern, water is has been documented well. And in the 21st century, water crisis, according to the World Water Report of 2014, is a crisis in governance. So the management of this crucial resource is a necessity that we have to tackle in our societies. So this is the statement of the problem for my paper. So the study aims to understand the nature of water contests or water conflicts. Take note, I use this interchangeably, but there are nuances as to what are water contests and water conflicts. Water contests and water conflicts in the Philippines from the perspective of multiple ontologies as proposed by Yates et al. So the questions that have been raised in this paper are the following. How do water actors think or perceive of water? Is it instrument, or is it a lifeblood? No, is it? Do we think of water as a utility, or do we think of it as a part and parcel of our daily existence, part of our culture and identity? Then, what kind of water policies are created out of these differing views? And do these differences in perceptions create water conflict in the first place? So here is the theoretical framework. I use three different theories to actually understand water as a phenomenon and as a political reality, or rather as a resource as well. No, so Yates et al. Forms the backbone of my paper and for much of my other papers that are related to this one. Water as an instrument, or water as lifeblood, no, or water as part of identity and culture. Then I also use the concept of structural discrimination by Alamon. This is in relation to the fact that many authors have cited that in the Philippines, particularly the author Rola and her co-authors have mentioned that government is the prime water actor in the Philippines, and as such, there are many sectors in society that are left out. Alamon's writing also coincides with this one in that his analysis of the plight of the Lumads have made mention of several issues where Lumad lands, wherein rivers are situated, have also been appropriated by government forces in order to take control of certain resources and extract them. Of particular note are water and minerals. And then the framework of water politics by Feldman and Mulinga is also complementary in this, in that water is also a sphere or a field wherein conflicts regarding politics and resources are present. So as for water and lifeblood, if I may read no, from the second part just to expedite the presentation. So water conflicts are not necessarily about technical or scientific understanding of water-related issues, and they are not simply about a lack of dialogue or agreement about how water should be used or managed. Rather, they are ontological disjuncture, conflicts over the very essence of water. Hence, why my paper started with how do water actors perceive of water? Because, for example, for certain actors like the government, water is a tool, or rather is a utility. No, it's an instrument to feed major urban centers and to continue commercial life and even life itself in many urban centers in the Philippines. But for sectors like the Lumad and for the local peoples who are living in the sources of water, living in or around the sources of water like rivers, um, those sources of water are not just tools, but it is part of their identity as to who they are, and they are bound to those sources. So in this regard, no, Yates et al. Provides a crucial theoretical tool to understanding water. And then also, is water political, which is the core question of that I've been trying to tackle for years. I have came across several authors on which I have anchored my claims. Dorskin has made a claim as early as the 1970s that water is a public arena with very high public interest due to differences on how water is valued by everyone. So those values inform water conflicts and also water consensus along the way. Molinga, in a later work in 2008, mentions that water management, no, he used the framework integrated water management, is inherently political due to the inclusion of good governance factors such as accountability, transparency, and responsiveness in um, in the use of water or the appropriation of water as a resource. Then later on, Fieldman, writing a decade later, also mentions that the process of water supply politics generally involves an interplay of interests between actors of unequal power and as exercised through various forums. So as we can see, the framework of water politics is really situated in decolonization, in the fact that the relationship between, for example, government and the various sectors in society is very uneven. It's really a David versus Goliath struggle in this regard. And the I cited are quite numerous, and I'll be going over them briefly just to give the audience what I've been talking about, not just to give them a brief overview of the studies that I have reviewed. Yates et al. Was mentioned primarily because their studies on multiple ontologies of water are based upon the struggles of the indigenous peoples in North America, particularly the native tribes, no, the Native American tribes in North America. They've been using this framework of water as lifeblood to push for their struggle to be recognized as stakeholders of water. In the United States, in the 20th century, there has been numerous hydrological projects, dam buildings in particular, that has created water conflicts across that. And this framework of Yates et al. Can be applied in the Philippines, in particular with the emerging project of the Kaliwa Dam. I have not included that in my paper, but I seek to include that in a future study as well. And Abers and Keck, although their study is based in Turkey, but their study is on how different sectors participate in water governance. And this is crucial in the sense that it gave us a perception as well as to why politics or why water should be participatory in that sense. No, why water politics should be participatory and not something that is imposed upon communities. Then Araral and Wong mentions in their water governance review, which I patterned my study after, that there is a lack of unified framework, and that is still true today, with water laws in the Philippines numbering in several. I believe there are 7 or 8 about this one, particularly the water code on the national level, as copied by Davao, for example, and Cebu is also trying to copy a local water code for the province. But as to what happened to those efforts, they have been stalled, or it has been stalled since Governor Davidic was since Governor Davide's term was over. No? So in that regard, Araral and Wang informed us of the problems of a lack of unified framework, and in particular, this has also not taken into account of the multiple ontologies of water mentioned by Yates et al. Then we have earlier studies from Contreras and Elesanguin that have mentioned about waters since the early 2000s, and many of these studies involve indigenous communities, or rather local communities, fighting against the interests of powerful groups like the government in imposing water agendas that have not been consultative and that has created problems for them. Some of these issues were resolved, others were not. And this really provides us with the general context upon which we find this study today, which is that it tends to be, and this is according to the last study we're citing here, by Rayla et al. It's actually 2 papers, by the way, that the state is the prime actor in water governance. So the state has the initiative in water governance in the Philippines, and it certainly creates disparities of power and disparities of how resources like water should be distributed. Hence, I go back to the basic definition of politics by Harold Laswell: who gets what, when, and how. In this regard, the resource of water is a major source of not only political power, but also conflict. So in analysis, I also lump up what I found out about this one. No? I lump up my findings here. The informal sectors across the literature that I've just cited is that most of those informal sectors are not involved in water policies. In fact, they are expected to follow the lead of government with very little consultation at all, or if not, they are strong-armed into submitting to the will of the state in many of the cases of water policies not being implemented. Case in point, dam buildings in the Philippines, like the Angat Dam, and with more recently with the Kaliwa Dam project, which serves to fulfill the needs of Manila at the expense of the local peoples of that area. Then water politics really needs a unified framework to mitigate contestations. How do we take into account, for example, the problem of let's say customary laws or norms among indigenous peoples regarding water that outsiders may find as strange, or may altogether dismiss? No. So in this regard, the local knowledge of local peoples, of indigenous peoples around those water sources, are disregarded for more so-called scientific approaches to water, and to approaches to water that are serving the needs of the urban centers, at the same time neglecting the local realities of the stakeholders themselves. And then I recommend that broader studies on water contestations be undertaken. No? And this is for my study here. This is the second part. I've also presented a paper earlier last year about entitled as Contested Waters. And this is where the framework of Yates et al. First came into play. So this is, I would say that my study is a different car, but with the same engines, no? But on a different forum, and utilizing a new perspective, the perspective of decolonization. So with that, I believe that my paper is fitted for this forum, and I would like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to present what I have learned, what I have studied so far, and what I continue to study in the near future. And so, for concluding words, I would like to cite my good friend, Assistant Professor Ron Dangkalan of UP, that academics have the moral responsibility to co-create knowledge and policies with the communities. And so with that, thank you and good morning, everyone.
Thank you, Ryan, for the very gold presentation. I particularly like the metaphor that you used. Who would have thought that the water we're drinking is gold? And certainly, once it is rendered as gold, it will be subjected to contestation and conflict. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank
So
you,
now let's have a coffee break from the presentation of Twinkle Bautista. Are you there already, Twinkle? Your request is granted to have 5 minutes more for your presentation. All right,
Thank you
go
so
ahead.
much.
Let's have coffee.
Thank you so much. So good morning, everyone. My name is Twinkle or Tala. And thank you for joining my presentation. I am from the Sumatra First Nation from the Philippines, from Kalinga, Philippines. So before I start, I would like to honor the indigenous peoples of Shenandoah Valley. I think I'm frozen. All right. Where I am currently located. So I would just like to note if I am frozen.
I'm not sure. Are you trying to share your screen?
Oh, not yet, not yet.
Oh, not yet. Okay. I think you're coming good.
Okay, thank you so much. So the place where I am at was the trading and hunting grounds of the Suwin, Muskogean, and Haudenosaunee people. Indigenous peoples, most of them no longer live here because of colonization. And they may not be as visible in public spaces as other people groups, but they exist. So my presentation is dedicated to all people who have been marginalized and oppressed because of their identities. To begin with, let me share a story, and I'm sharing my presentation now.
Go ahead. You can share.
Just needs to. There you go. So this story is a favorite of many kids from my community, and it is the story of Fisuno. And it goes like this. It is the first day of class for Fisuno, and he is very excited to go. When he arrived in the classroom, his teacher asked him, "What is your name?" Fisuno, not knowing English, looked at the teacher, wondering what that meant. The teacher repeated the question, but Fisuno kept quiet. Exasperated, the teacher told Fisuno to go home and ask his parents. Fisuno went home and looked for his mother. "Ina," he said, "my teacher is asking me what is my name? What is your name?" Thankfully, the mother understands a little English. She said, "Memorize this, son. Tell your teacher, my name is Fisuno." And so Fisuno went back to school, but while walking, he saw a bird. He watched the bird fly majestically, and when the bird was out of sight, Fisuno forgot what he should tell his teacher. Fisuno went back to his mother to ask again. While walking back to school, a huge bullfrog jumped across his path, and Fisuno was scared out of his wits and forgot again what he should tell his teacher. So Fisuno went back to his mother, and she got angry with him. She said, "I'm going to tell you one last time, and if you come back again, I will spank you." Fisuno walked to school muttering over and over again, "My name is Fisuno." He was concentrating so hard he did not see a rock in the path and he fell down. Unfortunately, Fisuno forgot again what he should tell his teacher. He was afraid of his spanking, so he went to the forest instead. In time, Fisuno got hungry and he saw fugnay trees, or bugnay. He went to the first tree and asked, "Fugnay, fugnay ner or "Fugnay, fugnay, are you ripe?" And the fugnay tree answered, "Ner-nan poon o, tsaanan kawis o." Or, "My trunk is ripe but not my branches." So he went to the second tree and asked the same thing, "Fugnay, fugnay, ner-a?" And the fugnay tree answered, "Ner-nan kawis o, tsaanan poon o." Or, my branches are ripe but not my trunk. So he went to the third tree and asked the same question. And the fugnay tree answered, "Ner-ma," or "I am ripe." So Fisuno climbed the tree and ate as much of the berries as he wanted. He was so full that he got drowsy. But a naughty spirit came along and saw Fisuno sleeping on the tree. And the spirit whisked Fisuno away to his house. And from this point, the story is embellished by the storyteller, and it can go on in different ways. While I was preparing for this presentation, I was contemplating to remove this story due to time constraint. But I decided in the end to share it as a statement of my priority, centering indigenous worldviews through storytelling. This story contains lessons that guided me as I wrote this research. First, the story of Fisuno can be shaped in many ways, but it always starts the same way. The phrase "fugnay, fugnay, ner-a" always indicates that it is Fisuno's story. It taught me to determine my starting point, which is my identity as an indigenous woman from the Philippines. That identity was articulated in the theoretical framework and in the whole research process that followed the indigenous research paradigm. Second and third, it shows how privileging one language over the other can be used to exclude people and their worldviews. And that a good thing, such as formal education, when imposed in a context, can be harmful. This means that the definition of terms used in this research takes into account the definitions given by the participants vis-a-vis other definitions. Fourth is the method of storytelling. Storytelling is a huge part of my indigenous community's meaning-making processes. So in various spaces like community meetings, meaning-making is not done by a single person, but by the people gathered who are listening to stories. With this, even though I, as a researcher, made meaning with the stories I gathered, this presentation invites listeners to make meaning of their own and share it. It is an invitation to reflect on the parts of the stories that resonate with you deeply, and not just to focus on the aspects that I am giving importance to. It is also an invitation to reflect who has had the space to talk for the longest time and who has been silent. So because of time constraints, I will be brief in describing these concepts. An indigenous research paradigm is informed by indigenous knowledge system, critical theory, post-colonial discourses, feminist theories, and neo-Marxist theories. Truth and realities are shaped by one's relationships with the whole of the cosmos, living and non-living. This paradigm challenges deficit thinking and pathological descriptions of the colonized. It reconstructs a body of knowledge to carry hope and promote transformation and social change among the historically marginalized and oppressed. An indigenous research agenda can be summarized in 4 major tides and 4 major directions. So the tides are survival, recovery, development, and self-determination. The directions are healing, mobilization, decolonization, and transformation. So the indigenous agenda asks these questions. In the methodology, the culture and worldview of the participants were centered. The value of relationships was at the forefront. So with this as my foundation, this presentation focuses on the story of Peacebuilders community or PBCI, and Coffee for Peace, or CFP. As an overview, PBCI is a Mennonite nonprofit organization in the Philippines and led and shaped by Filipinos that envisions a country with its nations experiencing what peace is. CFP, on the other hand, is a for-profit social enterprise that was born out of the peacebuilding work of PBCI. And we will get to know more about these two organizations as we get along. The main research question is, how can a peace framework shape a social enterprise? And what does the decolonization and localization look like for a peacebuilding organization in collaboration with a social enterprise? So the four sub-questions are the following, which will be discussed in the results section, except for the fourth one. So in approaching these questions, my theoretical framework is Paniyaw, Ngilin, and Bain, and the peace framework of PBCI and CFP. So the Paniyaw, Ngilin, and Bain are the core values that the Kalinga people have. So Paniyaw are values that govern relationship with the spiritual realm. Ngilin are values that govern relationship with the self and with creation. Bain are values that govern relationship with others. So these values are what holds the Pochon, an indigenous governance that encompasses all aspects of Kalinga life. So this Pochon is the language for peace among Kalinga. It is a concrete representation of the word peace that has no direct translation in the Kalinga language. So these values, or the P and the Paniyaw, Ngilin, and Bain, are reflective of the peace framework that PBCI and CFP hold. It is based on the Judeo-Christian faith, which can be summarized in the following: harmony with the Creator, spiritual with the being, psychosocial transformation, harmony with others, social political transformation, and harmony with the Creator, economic ecological transformation. So these two frameworks are similar in a way that the individual aspects cannot be separated from each other. So each aspect is distinct and they are also one. So following these worldviews, it means that to work for peace is to transform these aspects, to recognize that we are interconnected organisms and not as mechanical doers that can be put in boxes. So my conceptual frameworks and the definition of terms. How do I decide on the definition of a word? In her article Speaking of Nature, Robin Wall Kimmerer, an indigenous author, showed how a word in a language carries with it a whole worldview. She said that a word shapes the way we see the world, and that linguistic imperialism is a tool of colonization. So I imagine myself in a community meeting with my people and asking them what they would think of peace, peace building, decolonization, localization, and social entrepreneurship. For the first two terms, peace and peace building, there would be a lot of discussion generated because it is part of our worldview. But for decolonization and localization, I cannot imagine how the discussion would go. My indigenous community does not have words for it. As for social entrepreneurship, there is a word in our language, but it has a divergence with how it is defined in the English language. With this, I acknowledge that I picked the meaning of decolonization, localization, and social entrepreneurship based on other published works and my experiences also. Peace and peace building were defined in this project based from our language and by the people I interviewed in convergence with other definitions. So peace building, for the Kalinga, the Pochon, the word that connotes peace speaks of concrete actions. For PBCI and CFP, the PAR framework says that peace building is shalom living or living out peace. John Paul Lederach wrote that peace building is a comprehensive strategy and wide array of activities. Putting these concepts together, peace building then is concrete actions for transformation, actions that lead to peace as defined by the people who are most impacted by the unjust structures in our society. Furthermore, peace building, like the human being, cannot separate the aspects of spirituality, emotion, cognition, and physical body. It sees the peace builder as interconnected with others within systems. Decolonization. To describe decolonization, I have to understand colonization first. understanding colonization involved acknowledging the pain it brought me and the communities I am part of. Written accounts of colonizers show that our people, tribes who live in the north of the Philippines, were not subdued because my ancestors fought. However, this type of colonialism, also called political colonialism, is just one form. Bagele-Chalisa named scientific colonialism that pertains to the production of knowledge and ethics in social science research, and an imposition of the positivist paradigm to the colonies and historically oppressed groups. There is also cultural hegemony, named by Antonio Gramsci, which is the domination by the ruling class through ideological and cultural means. So as an indigenous child growing up in the margins of the country, I may not have experienced the colonization fought by my ancestors, but I certainly felt cultural hegemony and scientific colonialism. And as I feel it, I face it by what Sherry Mitchell says as the most effective way of overcoming colonization, embracing the wisdom of our own cultural traditions and familiarizing with the cultural values that guide those traditions. Decolonization then is the deconstruction of colonial ideologies of the superiority and privilege of colonizing powers. It involves dismantling structures that perpetuate the status quo and addressing unbalanced power dynamics. It involves valuing and revitalizing indigenous knowledge and approaches. Localization. With the various discussions on what local is, this research acknowledges the elasticity of local. The word in itself takes its meaning in relation to the dominant structures, geographical, political, economic, social, intellectual, and whatever structures we have. With this research chose to define local based on the context in which it is being used. So the locus are the people who have the lesser power politically, economically, socially in relation to the dominant global structures. So for example, within CFP, the local would be people at the bottom of the human resources organizational chart. With PBCI, the local would be the community people we work with. With international partners, CFP and PBCI would be considered as local. Social entrepreneurship. So like localization, social entrepreneurship has no precise definition and it changes from country to country based on its laws. To summarize the definitions of social enterprise in various scholarships, it pertains to ownership, organizational values and motivation, and social impact. As for my indigenous community, there is no direct translation in our language. A somewhat related word would be manlabfu, which means to work for a living. But through the ways that phrase was used in our language, it means not exploiting available resources for the present time, being a steward of those resources for the future generations, and taking care not to deprive other beings, whether animals or whether humans or animals, of their own sustainability. So again, due to time constraints, I will only be sharing snippets from, and I will not be sharing this too, sorry. From the first 3 research questions, and I will not go deeply, I actually passed it, the definitions of peace by the participants. But following the indigenous research paradigm, the data was analyzed through the lens of the participants, which includes me, towards a transformation of peacebuilding practice. So the initial step before answering the research questions was to define peace from the respondents' own lived experiences. So for the research question 1, how did the peace framework give birth to CFP? Before there was Coffee for Peace, there were goats. This goat adventure is a crucial lesson for PBCI, what it means to localize and decolonize. So it was planned in the beginning of PBCI that it will aim to be self-sustainable financially. That time it was called income-generating projects. So during the first few years of PBCI, it started a project that aims to connect 10 Mennonite families to 10 Muslim families through goats. Mennonite is a denomination of the Judeo-Christian faith. So a Mennonite family will give 5 goats to a Muslim family, which is hoped to open a dialogue between the two. When the goat gives birth, the family will give a baby goat to another Muslim family, and so on. So it was a very good plan with the best of intentions, but it failed. The goats were either sold or eaten or prepared for a celebration. In retrospect, the PBCI founder, Lacan, said that it failed because the project was imposed from the top by an outsider, us. It is good in concept, but it failed to truly listen to the context of the people on the ground who were facing war and whose short-term needs are stronger than medium-term or long-term plans. So in my interview with him, he was imagining a conversation with the Muslim families about this goat adventure. And he imagined the Muslim family telling him, "You ask us if we want goats. Of course we said yes. You ask us if we can breed those goats. Of course we said yes. Why should we refuse your goats? But you did not see our context." This is one of the stories that paved the way for Coffee for Peace. So in contrast to the GOAT project, CFP was born out of observing the culture and context of the people. So during peace building meetings, people would ask, how can we talk about peace if our stomachs are hungry? The CEO of CFP, Georgie, noticed that in all meetings, whether by Christians, Muslims, and indigenous peoples, coffee would be served. And she thought that coffee can be an icon for peace because it is something that unites these three people groups. So peace houses were built, and these houses provided physical space for groups in conflict to have a dialogue. And during the dialogue, coffee was served, and it worked. Simultaneously, Peace Cafe was established in Davao City. It was originally planned to be a space for peace building and development workers in the area. Meanwhile, the peace houses were serving its purpose. Dialogues were happening, and one local community member said that the coffee being served are kapi sa kalilintan. It is a Maguindanaoan language, which when translated to English is coffee for peace. So the concept and the name of the business were local. So CFP was registered, and from the beginning, it was set that the values of business are farmers, environment, and peace builders. It has not changed until now. And in CFP, we say that peace is our product. Coffee is just a tool. So as the business started to grow, the question of supply came to be. Where can CFP buy coffee? So that question opened the opportunity to develop trainings on coffee production, intertwined with peace and reconciliation trainings. Coffee roasting with emphasis on specialty coffee was developed. Now we are continuously developing coffee processing centers. Plans are in place for indigenous ecotourism learning centers in partnership and led by indigenous peoples. All this in God's time. From that small serendipitous beginning, CFP grew. This process of growth reflects the yin and yang of peace building, and it shows the harmony of having a clear structure, clear vision, and yet having the space for emergence that springs from the local wisdom and kairos moments. Kairos that says it is the right time, the critical time, where all resources harmonizes for a vision. And it is not the chronos time that can be manipulated and can be measured by the clock. So the peace framework shaped CFP in its incubation and startup years by centering the needs of the people most impacted by conflict, listening to the needs of the environment, and being cognizant of the requirements of the market. So for the research question 2, to distinguish from the first question that focused on CFP's incubation and startup years, this question focuses on its present operations. So these are the 4 teams that emerged, but I will just give a summary of the first 2. So this figure shows the figure on the right shows the CFP-PBCI relationship. So the input of PBCI is the training on relational harmony, coffee plantation management, and community organizing. The output of CFP is global quality coffee. So in addition to this, the people who have key positions in PBCI are the same people who lead CFP. So regarding community relationships, PBCI's approach is similar to civil rights organizer of the Ella Baker, in which there is focus on long-term local leadership development and decentralization. So the park communities or the coffee farming communities are not tied to PBCI structurally, and they do not have to carry the PBCI name, they do not have to put our logo, and they craft their own vision and for peace and programs based on their own context. So the independence of local communities from the central organization and the local centeredness of program identification and implementation are also similar to Baker's organizing tenets. So for the research question 3, There were 8 themes that emerged. I will be sharing a bit of each except for numbers 2, 3, and 6, just for time limit. So CFP as an alternative to war. A field worker who was with PBCI in its early days shared, we would go to armed conflict zones, and people's reasons for going to war is the inability to provide for their family's needs. So some people join the revolutionary group for money. So we say, instead of going to war to get money, why don't you try growing coffee instead? We will buy your produce. This is relevant because there is always a struggle for right to self-determination and getting access to social funds. And people felt that they will only be heard when they go to war. So I will go immediately to number 4, which is the funding model for peace building. In the common funding model, power dynamics are skewed in favor of the international funders. So one way to address this is the creation of CFP as a funding source for PBCI. As an enterprise, CFP earns money to directly support PBCI. It also provides a space for international partners to be invited as impact investors and not just donors. We're not charity. Furthermore, this model invites community partners as investors and not beneficiaries. They are our partners, and this helps balance the power relations. So one field worker says, it is a common belief for outsiders to think that the communities are very poor. Yes, they may be poor economically, but they are not beggars. They have resources. As peace-building field workers, let us not dismiss that. 5th is concretizing peace. Oh. I remember one community who told us in 2013, peace for us is when we can sell our coffee at a high price. Since the beginning, CFP has practiced fair trade principles. So in this model, the farmer paid a fair price, which is higher than the market price. So farmers are paid upon delivery, which is different from the prevailing practice where they are paid weeks or months after. Farmers are not forced into a contract with CFP, even though PBCI provides the capacity building aspect. In fact, PBCI trains the farmers to in negotiation to be able to command a better price for their product. They will actually negotiate with us. And CFP introduces the farmers to other buyers, which creates competition for us. So field workers explain that this approach is for farmers to take the power that they inherently have. We are not empowering them. They have that power, while transforming the value chain in their favor. With it, the farmers experience what peace and justice looks like for their labor. Neighboring communities witness a sustainable economic model shaped by peace, thus influencing them to try the model. I will go to redefining the cross-cultural model, the 7th. So the PBCI CEO, shared that one elder told him one day, the cross-cultural model you are teaching us is human-centered, which is fine. However, communication does not only include humans. The spirits also communicate. As a peace-building worker, I have experienced several times the implication of this. So if spirits are a critical part of the communication process of communities we work with, then it is important to recognize the spirit's role in our peace building. We cannot disregard spirituality in our engagement. It is in fact an important issue because PBCI and CFP are faith-inspired organizations that also believe in spirits. And the last, number 8 is the personal journey of the peace-building field workers. Finally, decolonization and localization are also evident in the personal journeys of the peace-building field workers. To my colleagues, I apologize summarizing your stories in a phrase. The field workers articulated growth in embracing and affirming their identity, their spirituality, their development to be an entrepreneur, and reconciliation to their family's narratives. So one peace-building worker said that her engagement with farmers reconciled her to the land. She and her clan were displaced from their ancestral domain by a powerful family, and she witnessed their land into a commercial, being turned into a commercial resort, desecrating burial grounds. With this history, she said, I never wanted to do anything with land again. But when I train farmers, there's always a doubt at the back of my mind. What gives me the authority to teach farming when I do not have any experience about it? And she's sharing this to me. This encouraged her to start a coffee farm with her partner. Her story resonates with me and with other peacebuilding workers. We learned to appreciate our farming heritage and went back to cultivating our land. It can be said then that the peacebuilding work of respondents is an overflow of the internal work they are doing. So in conclusion, the stories gathered from PBCI and CFP show that a social enterprise shaped by a peace framework can help decolonize and localize peacebuilding. And lastly, this research has become my own journey of decolonization. I never knew how much how much my mind is colonized. Starting from the choice of topic until its completion, it was a continuous reflection of what it means to do this work as an Indigenous woman. I have experienced many times what it means to be silenced, to be discriminated against, to be invisible in public spaces because of my being an Indigenous woman. So this constant silencing in public spaces unknowingly led to silencing within my intrapersonal communication. So it is a very long journey to reclaim my voice and convince myself that I do have something to share. And this research is part of that journey. My writing of this was a full body experience in which I felt and acknowledged the pain of marginalization brought by colonization. So as I present, it is not just an academic exercise. It is an exercise of the whole being that is slowly coming out alive. Thank you so much for journeying with me.
Thank you, Tala. That was a very decolonizing presentation. I particularly like the articulation of one of the farmers that you've interviewed, and the statement is bold statements against international funding agencies and multinational coffee companies. Planting coffee is also planting for peace. How wonderful. Huh? So thank you so much, Tala. And I'd like to call on now the last presenter, Archill from the University of the Philippines in Cebu. Archill, are you there?
Yes, hello. Good morning to each and every one of us.
All right, Archill. Yes, okay. Yes, you may proceed.
Hello. Okay, so allow me to share my screen for a while. Okay, I suppose that's it. Okay, here we go. Is my screen visible now?
Yes, Archill.
Okay, so I shall now proceed. So first I would like to congratulate the prior two presenters and the organizers of this particular conference, because it is moving on so smoothly. So my presentation is entitled Traversing the Intersections of Decoloniality and Liquid Modern Consumerism in Human Trafficking. Human trafficking and international relations being my area of interest, research interest. So that's me, Archill Capistrano from the University of the Philippines, Cebu. Okay, so let me just move forward. Okay, so here's the flow of my presentation. So basically I wish to answer the question, where do decoloniality and liquid modern consumerism intersect in TIP, or trafficking in persons? So human trafficking, trafficking in persons, I use them interchangeably in this presentation. So from here, I will have three major segments in the presentation. So I look at the cost mobility and trafficking in persons as a liquid problem. And then of course, I move forward to gadgetized consumerism. We will know more about that. And then the decolonial imperative in framing trafficking in persons. I express much appreciation to these references, Chen, Kuraming, and Musavi, other than Quijano and Mignolo, of course, as the major works about decoloniality that inform this presentation. Okay, so just a bit of definition of terms. I would like to present human trafficking or trafficking in persons, the essence as stated in the UNODC, or the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. So it is dissected basically into three parts: the act, the means, and the purpose. So as far as the act is concerned, you will notice that it can be summarized in the word mobility. And by mobility, I also include here the concept of mobile interconnectedness, meaning in real time, not just physically, but also in cyberspace. The means, you will notice that it can be summarized into the use of power and exploitation of vulnerability. And then, of course, you have the purpose. So for the purpose, I will zero in on sexual exploitation. Okay, so from here, I draw much of this presentation from my chapter contribution in the recently published International Studies in the Philippines. That's in chapter 13. It's exploitative, so it's sexual exploitation. It's exploitative human trafficking in, out of, and beyond the Philippines, a liquid problem in a cosmopolar international system. Of course, when we say liquid problem, the mother concept is basically from the concept of liquid modernity by Zygmunt Bauman. Now, as probably a little bit of a backgrounder, Zygmunt Bauman is actually a Polish sociologist. He passed away in 2017. So I can imagine already there may be certain questions as to whether or not this is traversing decoloniality, because my point of reference is not necessarily from the global south, but somebody from Europe, from Poland, okay? But then again, I would probably implead Chen in his work when he talks about interreferencing, about being informed by scholars, regardless of whether they are from the north or from the south, but as to whether or not these explanations make sense in the experiences of the locals, okay? And then, of course, there is freedom. It's still by Zygmunt Bauman. This has a very good explanation and discussion about global capitalism, which is imbricated in the Westphalian system and is where the heart of the intersection really is. Okay. And then, of course, consuming life, still by Zygmunt Bauman. So in my chapter 13, I presented the cosmopolar reality in terms of human trafficking, particularly sex trafficking or sexploitative human trafficking, where the global north and the global south are, where instead of cosmopolitanism, there is cosmopolarity that would divide actually or bifurcate the world into the global north and the global south. You will notice here that the global north, it is where demand comes from, and supply side is from the global south. I am highlighting here, this is provided in this for this presentation, the concept of consumption and consumerism. Okay, so from here, let me look at where or what the status of human trafficking globally is. There are two reports, the UN Global Trafficking in Persons report, which is published biannually or once in 2 years. And then there is the annual publication of the Trafficking in Persons report by the US State Department. In the current 2020 report, these are the tier 1 countries. And you will notice that the Philippines figures among these tier 1 countries. In fact, the Philippines has been in and continues to be in tier 1 status since 2016, until, of course, the present. So that's 5 years already, half a decade, okay? Although in our history, it's quite ironic. We've had a two-time status of tier 2 watch list. Okay, what are the tiers? So the tiers actually would be a range of the level of compliance with countries' efforts on combating trafficking. Particularly, this is based not, by the way, on the United Nations human trafficking, anti-human trafficking protocol, but this is actually based on the US Trafficking Victims Protection Act, or TVPA. So countries are actually judged according to their compliance level. And tier 1 is the highest, while tier 3 is the lowest. And I said earlier that the Philippines actually was a tier 2 watch list for, I think, twice in our history. It's just that this particular tier ranking is such that if you are in the tier 2 watch list for 2 or more consecutive years, you will be downgraded to tier 3. And the implication is that you will not be receiving aid that would help you in combating trafficking. So in essence, you would see here the coloniality of power, in the sense that the US is asserting its own standards on how to combat trafficking. Okay, so that's one point that I am trying to show. It's a state-centric thing. Okay, now from the tier 1 status comes the irony that the Philippines registers as the #1 global source of child pornography. It is a #1 hub for live stream sexual abuse of children. I am particularly passionate about this because I also work in the Children's Legal Bureau, and this is part of our advocacy. And so you will note that in this UNICEF report, 8 out of 10 or 80% of our posterity is basically at risk of online sexual abuse. In a Rappler article, these are the reasons stated as to why there is a persistence of OSEC, or online sexual exploitation of children, in the country. Okay, and Cebu is very much the hot spot of OSEC. Widespread poverty. So basically these are that. And please note the last paragraph. UNICEF also noted the alarming involvement of children's family members as crime facilitators. So dysfunctional family is one of them. Yet, is it really poverty? So you will notice earlier that in the prior slide that there is such a thing as impleading poverty as the reason, so that you will need income and then you will commodify bodies of children and of women in this online sexual exploitation enterprise. But in my prior workplace at the University of San Carlos, there was a research by the students of political science that would point out that it's not exactly poverty. Well, poverty is one, but in the locale, particularly in Cordoba, Cebu, a lot of the families there are not really impoverished. Of course, we can always argue about how we define poverty, because there may be colonial understandings of poverty and non-colonial understandings of poverty. But the thing is, one important thing that stood out in the researches by undergraduate students is that there is really much consumerism in families. They want to own gadgets and dresses and fancy things. And this is what causes them to display themselves in order for them to earn money over the web. I follow naturally with this particular presentation, this particular slide, because the Philippines has once again become a top-notcher, not only in sexual tourism and child pornography online, but also what I call gadgetized consumerism. In the Hootsuite and We Are Social report, not only in 2019, but the latest one in 2020, the Philippines continues to be the top internet and social media use. Of course, this may be digital power, but to my mind, this kind of cyberspace mobility is both good and bad in the sense that it can also bring vulnerability to those who are exposed in cyberspace. And so back to the earlier slide, when I mentioned about consumerism, the need to consume things, phones, gadgets, or gadgetized consumerism, basically is something that resonates with what Bauman in Consuming Life said about the problem of flawed consumers. When consumers want to consume because it is imbricated in global capitalism that we have to consume. Robbins in Global Social Problems would talk about the doctrine of perpetual growth, that countries base their net worth on their capacity to consume. Hence, consumption and consumerism becomes the norm. To those who cannot, they struggle to consume. And for these flawed consumers, when they go to the web and expose themselves in order to earn, they themselves become the products that they market in their zest to want to consume things. And that is the irony that Bauman actually pinpoints in Consuming Life. Then moving forward to the decolonial imperative in framing trafficking in persons. Now, another layer that actually is present in this discourse of trafficking in persons is that you will note that based on Trafficking in Persons report, the main frame of reference, the lens that we look at in looking at trafficking in persons, is the criminalization or punitive or prosecutorial frame. That's the way to look at it. Yet, and then we see that this criminalization bandwagon really took effect right after 2000, when the TVPA of the US came about, okay? Because the trafficking in persons was way ahead of that. But the TVPA of the US, when it came out, and then the year after, in 2001, this year one, the very start of the Trafficking in Persons report, okay? When you have the tier rankings, you will notice then the bandwagon. This is true for the rest of the world, but I am in this slide trying to show the bandwagon in the Southeast Asian countries. So you will notice the Philippines is at the top, and we even updated and expanded the Anti-Trafficking in Persons Act of 2003 in 2012. And so you will notice all the others, okay? Then why is this something that I would say a decolonial imperative of framing? Because most of the corpus of works, researches, and even policies about trafficking in persons gravitates or focus towards the supply side, the place of origin, the countries of origin, instead of the countries of destination, where people, the trafficked persons, are placed, okay? And you will notice at the very center of my framework, it is the nation states. And again, because this is the Westphalian system, okay? And it is imbricated with global capitalism, including the use of technology in this case. And so much commodification has been in the literature. Much efforts have been made, particularly the 3 Ps and R. 3 Ps, protection, prevention, prosecution, and repatriation of trafficking victims. There was even a time when the trafficking victims, or VOTs, victims of trafficking, were considered transgressors of, transgressors, I only have 5 more minutes, okay. Transgressors of border or immigration laws because they breach border security. Okay. So we will notice, therefore, from the security block in this particular presentation, security, we have border security versus human security. Okay, so there was that tension before. Now, of course, with the criminalization bandwagon, we notice that a lot of the discourse are more towards the supply side. You read the Trafficking in Persons report, and so much is talked about the 3 Ps and R. But demand, not much of demand is actually mentioned. It was only in 2010 when demand became one of the indicia of trafficking efforts. Okay, before that, there was there were mentions of demand, scattering of demand for trafficking or for sex acts that would cause sex trafficking in the prior tip reports. But in as early as 2000 and 2001, 2002, 2003, these first few years, not a mention about demand. Why is it important for somebody studying human trafficking? Because demand is, for me, for Global South scholars even, is a major culprit other than patriarchy or patriarchal demand for sex. Yet the discourse is focused on the supply side. So there seems to be this epistemic incuriosity, to borrow the words, the phrase of Lewis in 2018. There is this epistemic incuriosity about demand. Okay? Instead, there is gravitation towards supply. Why? Because there are other frames to look at trafficking in persons. And in my chapter 13 of the book that I showed earlier, there is the victim protection frame, although it still gravitates toward the supply side, but there is also the human rights frame. Okay. The problem really is, and when I said earlier about, when I talked about the problem of children being abused in their very own homes, supposedly in the security of their own family, human rights violations are actually happening in those homes. So this is really a matter that we need to look at. And so it is important, therefore, to have epistemic curiosity towards the demand side of the pole. This part I would show to you. This is a Filipina. You will notice there, a 10-year-old Filipino girl tracked down 1,000 pedophiles in just about 2 months when this thing operated. Note, she looks human, but actually she is a program. Her name is Sweetie. She was developed by NGO Terre Omnis, based in the Netherlands. Okay, it's a software that more or less helped surveil pedophiles. Why? Because apparently the Filipino child is the most marketable in online child sexual exploitation. One big question when this came out in 2013 is that, because there were civil liberties groups that actually oppose this, particularly in Australia, the main objection is gathering evidence this way is not good, because surveillance should be only in the monopoly of law enforcement. NGOs should be out of the picture. And so I posed the question, should surveillance be relegated, or should it be monopolized only by law enforcement? Even if NGOs may have or may develop the capability, because they are on the ground working, should NGOs not be allowed, therefore, to include themselves in surveillance? Another question, and this is really cogent for me, and I would invite you to answer this question with me. Is this a Northern-centric appropriation of Global South vulnerability? Because vulnerability in this case, in the case of Sweetie, has been turned into power. You're using the vulnerability of this particular persona to apprehend pedophiles. And usually a lot of them are from the North. I'm not saying there is none in the Global South, but a lot of them are from the North based on the research, my research. So is this an appropriation of Global South vulnerability? Is this objectification, once again, as was mentioned by one of our keynote speakers, SF Alatas, yesterday? Okay, this is one big question that may be good to answer also and think about. Okay, is it a source of power for us, our vulnerability? How do we feel about it in the Philippines, seeing that the Filipino child is the most marketable, and then using the persona of a Filipino child to apprehend pedophiles? And so, as a way of conclusion, the intersections that I see in this particular work is that we see basically global capitalism imbricated in the Westphalian state-centrism or nation-state system. And so we see also that solutions to trafficking in persons are state-centric and supply-directed. And I would say, as a call for action, as an action point, that we should cultivate epistemic curiosity on the patriarchal northern demand side. Now I am ready for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Archill, for that very, very pointed presentation. No? And just to highlight, no, Bowman is a favorite author of mine. I used to sleep with him, meaning I fell asleep whenever I read him. No? And you know how fluid or the mobility space that we are moving around can give rise to such immobilizing phenomenon as human trafficking, which is not a very pleasant way of reaching the other side of the world, the global north, no, which continues to dominate the global south, like the Philippines. And I particularly like the way you have raised the question of why is it only the suppliers become criminal as imposed by the Euro or global north-centric perspective of legal discourses and instruments. Thank you for that, Archill.